You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 7th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honour of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
we assess the last 24 hours in America as Donald Trump prepares to take charge of the most powerful country on earth for a second time. Also, Kamala Harris concedes her election but says she does not concede her fight that fueled the campaign. Also coming up, we'll look at how leaders in China and Europe have responded to the Trump victory as a slew of congratulatory words flood social media. We'll ask if this is an effort by governments to do some backpedaling.
But thankfully, they've agreed to go back to work, which means we can go back to building airlines again.
After 7 weeks and a 38% pay rise, Boeing workers return to their stations. We'll examine what the cost has been to the aviation industry as a whole and ask whether this sets a precedent. Plus the papers and a trip to Art Week Tokyo. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The German coalition government has collapsed, and Germany's chancellor is to call a confidence vote early next year. Ukrainian troops have reportedly clashed with North Korean forces for the first time, and the Australian government is to propose a ban on social media for children under 16. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories, but first, let's recap an extraordinary 24 hours in America's story. Having mounted the most extraordinary comeback imaginable, Donald Trump is now facing the prospect of not only having the White House, but also the Republicans enjoying control over both the House and the Senate. For the first time in the Republicans' history since 2004, Donald Trump also won the popular vote. So, from Wisconsin, let's cross live now to join Monocle's Vincent McAviney. A very good morning to you, Vinny.
Good morning.
And this is a huge deal for the Republicans in America, as this basically gives Trump the mandate to fulfill his pledges.
It's absolutely massive. And I think both Democrats and Republicans I've spoken to and pundits on both sides on the airwaves are still in shock about the scale of the victory, particularly the popular vote. As it stands, Donald Trump is about 5 million votes ahead of Kamala Harris. The Republicans had not won the popular vote for some 20 years. It was becoming very awkward for the future of the Electoral College without some kind of reform, because you had situations like in 2016 where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College, and people scratching their heads wondering how that can be healthy in a democracy. Not only does Trump return to the White House on what he'll point to as a clear majority and mandate from the electorate, there's no sort of 2016 questions about how much foreign interference or Jim Comey had in his victory. This is clear. He's won, and he also has the House and the Senate and a majority in the Supreme Court.
This is not what the polls had said beforehand. They had said it was absolutely neck and neck. So is there any sort of clear path that we can now see that helped Trump to defy the polls and get to the White House so quickly? Because all the pundits had suggested that probably at this stage we would still be talking about who'd won.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an overused phrase by James Carville, but, it's the economy stupid. He was presenting a very simple economic message, like MAGA, one borrowed directly from Ronald Reagan. It was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And that sort of had to employ a bit of kind of, collective amnesia, because 4 years ago, of course, was, still the height of the pandemic and things weren't great then. But he was sort of talking about his time before COVID had hit. The economy was high. He had inherited this great economy from, President Obama, that he had kind of managed to keep his administration had managed to kind of keep on going without major crisis. And this is now what the Biden administration is finding is that they've picked up what every other nation has had, which is incumbent fatigue. all around the world, the leaders that were present in the pandemic have either retired and their parties have lost, or they have themselves been booted out of office. Think of, Jacinda Ardern, even in New Zealand. If you think about the Conservatives in Britain, basically people blaming whoever kind of was last in charge during the pandemic for the problems of that time and what was created. And it seems that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris got lumped with that, and Trump managed to kind of remind people of their earlier time in his presidency for the first time around, and how good it was for them economically.
There's also the issue that was widely reported yesterday of this being the revenge of working class America. The New York Times has an excellent article today about the fact that one of the key drivers was not just the economy, but was immigration. They voted for Trump. Lifelong Democrat voters had decided that they wanted mass deportations, and they oppose a path to citizenship for undocumented people who've been living in the States for decades. This shift to the right, I mean, how much is that felt on the ground where you are?
So Wisconsin's a really interesting state because in the last census in 2020, it's 86% white, it is 5% black and 4% Hispanic and Latino. So it was the whitest of all the 7 swing states. And people I spoke to on election day were confident that they had done enough, Democrats were confident they'd done enough to secure the state for Kamala Harris, and that they were sending Tammy Baldwin back as their senator. Now, they did manage that just by a narrow margin. But this state, for only the fourth time in the last 50 years, went Republican. It was reliably Democrat, part of the blue wall, but it went twice for Reagan and twice for Donald Trump. And, last month I was at the Reagan Museum in California on a trip there, and it really struck me how much Trump had kind of, as much as he's a throwback to the 80s in so many ways, he has so co-opted the very clear, simple messages of Ronald Reagan. We all know that he lifted the sort of MAGA message, Make America Great Again, from Reagan's initial campaign. He has just lifted that economic message, were you better off under me? And for many working class people in this country, they don't feel like, as much as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would say on the economic indicators, particularly inflation, that they've got it back down, that gas prices are cheaper than they were 3 years ago. They just simply feel like they are not surviving. And part of it is generational. If you are a millennial or Gen Z, you're not better off than your parents were. And that's the same in many places in Europe as well. But in America, it was more baked into the American dream that you would get home ownership earlier, that your future would seem brighter, that you would feel more successful than your parents were. That is not the case here, and I think that is why it is potentially not just the sort of the working class that's come back and stung the Democrats, but particularly young people, because they didn't come out in the numbers needed for the Democrats to stay in power here. And I think that's part of the sort of the promise and the dream that you kind of sell to younger generations, that you're going to get those things that your parents got and then some. That doesn't seem the way anymore. It seems a lot harder now.
What about the future and the job ahead for Donald Trump, given the fact that the polarized nature of American politics is at one of its most extreme points? And there is a fear that a leader whose usual job is to unite a country will not try to do that. He will just dig in with his polarizing nature.
I don't think it's so much a fear, but it's an understanding who someone is. Donald Trump will be 78 years old, coming into office. He'll be the oldest elected president. People don't really change much. When you get to being an adult, you don't change. And when you get to being in your late 70s, you're not going to change. We know who Donald Trump is. And we've seen sort of, again, after the assassination attempt, the first one, it was, Donald Trump's going to be a uniter. He's going to have changed his demeanor. He's going to take everything more seriously. Donald Trump kind of played along with that for a couple of days. But then even in the conference speech, he made fun of that idea and very much went back to his base message and went back to his base, and he doubled down on his base. You go back to 2016 when he was elected the first time, in that space between the election and the inauguration, his sort of surrogates were saying he's going to unite. In that first inaugural speech, he made it very clear, America first, and that is how he he wasn't interested in his time in office in trying to unite the country. He likes to go out of his way to wind up those that oppose him. So I don't think, as much as they're going to say he wants to unite the country, he's going to look at having got 5 million more votes in the sort of gross in the sort of electoral total at the moment, and just think, well, I don't need to do that. I've got a majority on my side. Everyone else needs to bend to me.
Finally, Vinny, let's talk about Kamala Harris. No sign of her for hours and hours and hours, but when she did emerge, it was a very pugnacious concession speech. I think she used the word fight 16 times. There's a digging in of heels here. I mean, she had a dig in about the peaceful transition of power, but she called for this broad-based resistance of Donald Trump. It absolutely appealed to the Democratic heartland, which is you work on principles and you work on values. It was an assured and a compact speech, but was there a suggestion that we will get more of Kamala Harris, or was that her swan song calling to the Democrats to carry on without her?
Well, politics is unpredictable. If you'd have said, as Donald Trump was leaving on, Air Force One in 2021, with Frank Sinatra playing after January the 6th, that he would ever come back after skipping out on the inauguration of Joe Biden, you would have thought it was mad. But he has done that. So nothing is unforgivable in politics, it seems, and in public life, he has forever shifted the Overton window. What's interesting for Kamala Harris is, and I think she mentioned this herself, she only had 107 days of campaigning. She was potentially past the ball too late. That's what a lot of pundits are saying today. And that's what some people I've spoken to said is, she had a huge task to turn it around, to launch a campaign, to do it all, to be everything to everyone. And what's interesting is that, even on election day, there was a spike in Google trends of people querying, when did Joe Biden drop out? Why did Joe Biden drop out? Who is Kamala Harris? Those were trending highly in Google searches. And the fact is, people didn't think that they really knew who Kamala Harris was. And that was a criticism that she didn't have enough time. There was an early criticism that she wasn't doing enough media to introduce herself. And she was going up against someone who has run at varying degrees of intensity for the past decade. So everyone in this country knows who Donald Trump is, and they had formed an opinion, liking him or not. But people still weren't sure about Kamala Harris. And some will say that there is still misogyny and racism, and that, highest glass ceiling is really hard to hit. I think Kamala Harris might feel bitter that Joe Biden didn't pass the ball earlier. It's clear from her speech that she knew she had to, unlike Trump, distinguish herself, ensure the peaceful transfer of power, but present to people that followed her that she wasn't conceding any of the ground or her principles, only that principle that you stick with democracy and the peaceful transfer of power, and you continue to campaign. And I think, you can't mistake the fact that she ran a pretty good campaign. Some would say she didn't make any big mistakes. Her outreach could have been better, particularly to white people, to white working class people. She should have gone on Joe Rogan or sent Tim Walz to do that, but that didn't happen. She did raise over $1 billion. At the moment, looking at the next 4 years, the Democrats have to find someone to run against likely J.D. Vance, and they're going to have to find someone who can connect particularly with that group and a back to basics in terms of the economy and reaching to working people. Is that her? She might think she could have a chance if she has more time, but we'll see, because the Democrats will do a big autopsy on this all.
Vincent McAviney, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Let's move now to Europe and to get its reaction to the Trump victory. Joining me in the studio is Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Good morning, Nina.
Morning, Emma.
After a busy 24 hours, do you think Europe's ready or prepared for a Trump comeback? Many are suggesting that it's not.
Well, they've been trying to prepare themselves late in the day, let's say, particularly when it comes to the European Union, who sort of apparently set up a task force over the summer to sort of start to game out what a Trump 2.0 presidency would look like, how it would affect the bloc. trade-wise, because that is a huge issue, but also what it would mean for Europe's security, because, of course, as we know, he's not very keen on supporting Ukraine, which is just on the EU and NATO's shared border. He's made it very clear that he'd like Ukraine to agree to some kind of peace deal that could be unfavourable on their terms, and that would leave Europe's security very much hanging in the balance. So it's partly concerns about trade, partly concerns about security, and also just personal animosity between some of those leaders inside the European Union and Donald Trump. Some of them are queuing up to be his best friend and have actually established a strong relationship with him in years gone by, in particular Viktor Orban, whose country, Hungary, has enjoyed the rotating European Council presidency at the moment under the banner MEGA, Make Europe Great Again, not MAGA, Make America Great Again. So Viktor Orban was the first person to queue up to congratulate Donald Trump. We also saw Emmanuel Macron, who you remember did a lot to try and forge closer relationships with Donald Trump in Trump's first term in office after the 2016 election. He also was queuing up to make sure he could get back in his good books.
It's an interesting thing that we talk about, special relationships and what have you, and the idea of that personal relationship that leaders must enjoy in order for the sort of the optics to be right. But the former Trump advisor John Bolton yesterday said Trump has no philosophy. He does not think in political strategy. He thinks transactionally. He thinks from deal to deal. He does not think about the wider picture. This goes against everything that Europe works, the methods with which Europe works, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. If you've had to sit through any of those endless EU summits, as all of us have in years gone by, you definitely notice that. It really means that essentially whatever the pressing trouble of the day is, they have to debate it ad infinitum, pretend that it's a consensus, but essentially it's big countries like Germany and France that have the final say of the day. And of course, at the helm of the most important body of the European Union is Ursula von der Leyen, who is a German, indeed a former German defence secretary, and as such, plus ça change from that point of view. But I think when it comes to the EU, there are some big question marks over, how cohesive it's going to be in the next few years, notably because there's political change afoot in places like Germany and also in places like France. I'm sure we'll get to this in a second's time, but overnight it appears as though Olaf Scholz has torpedoed the current ruling German coalition, so they could be heading for fresh elections earlier than expected. That would mean a German election in 2016, and then, of course, Emmanuel Macron can't run for another term after 2027. All of this amid a rise in the far right in Europe.
Let's touch on this, what's happened overnight. The German governing coalition has collapsed. Olaf Scholz has fired his finance minister. We're looking at a confidence vote on the 15th of January next year. And when we read the headlines last night, I think the initial reaction was, why is Germany deciding to do this to itself just at the moment when Trump is getting into the White House and Europe needs to be strong and united? It does not need to be looking as if it's crumbling from within.
Well, it has some huge parallels, doesn't it, with Emmanuel Macron deciding to call that early election just after the European parliamentary elections, during which, of course, the centrist movements got trounced as well. The reality is that Olaf Scholz's coalition partners, the Greens on one side and the very pro-business Free Democrat Party on the right, are even more unpopular than his Social Democratic Party, that's also fallen quite substantially in the polls. We know this as per the recent regional elections in parts of eastern Germany, where the SPD only managed to just hold on to Brandenburg, where it hadn't lost an election since the unification of Germany. So it's losing huge support in parts of eastern Germany. That's going to be a real problem overall in terms of the polls. It seems as though if there were an election that were to be called sooner rather than later, even the SPD, certainly the Greens and the Free Democrats, would just get completely trounced by the Conservative Party that's in the ascendant over in Germany, and possibly elements of the far right could, gain a foothold as well in the power base in Germany. What's going on in Germany essentially is that their business model is broken. The reliance on cheap Russian gas is something they can't rely on anymore after the onset of US sanctions thanks to the war in Ukraine. And also they can't sell as many goods to China. And now, with Trump getting into office, he's promising to impose 20% tariffs on goods coming from the European Union. So all of this has clearly focused the pro-business Free Democrats' minds and forced Olaf Scholz to focus. And they've thought, what on earth am I going to do now? He even apologised for having to make this decision right now, saying, look, I recognise, as per the election in the United States, that these could be uncertain times for us in the future, but I feel like I need to take this decision now because I've just clashed with my coalition partners one time too many.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Well, one of the areas of foreign policy which some claim was neglected during the US presidential election was Washington's relationship with South America. And to tell us more, I'm joined by Andrew Thompson, journalist and political risk analyst specialising in Latin America. A very good morning to you, Andrew.
Good morning.
So Latino votes leaned more towards Trump than to Harris. Why is that? Did the Democrats not understand them and give them a different voice?
I think the Latino vote is quite a complicated block in the US elections, of course, since there are both right and left-wing Latinos and from different countries. So, yes, I think you can make the argument that the Democrats rather sort of relied on them as in previous years. They've always voted more Democrat than conservative than Republican, but things are changing, and the U.S. Democrats didn't adapt in step with the changes.
What is it about the fact that neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris seem to have a sort of a dedicated South American strategy when it came to their campaigning? I mean, it seems a very strange thing when it is literally the neighbours.
Yes, one of the worrying trends of recent years has been that the United States has pretty much sort of ignored Latin America or paid less attention to it than in the past. And I think that under Trump, that's going to continue with some major exceptions. The major exception being the whole issue of migration, with Trump promising mass deportations and even to close the border between the US and Mexico. And these are going to be, I think, the really big subjects of the next couple of years.
Why is that still becoming a huge issue? Because the vast majority of migrants to the United States are in the country legally, and the mix of where the immigrants are coming from has shifted in the last 4 years with a sharp decline in the number of people coming from Mexico. Where is the immigration issue now experiencing its pinch point?
I think at the bottom of this is an issue of perception. There is a perception in the United States that the country is being swamped by immigrants, largely from Latin America. It's a perception. There are many counter-arguments, but the perception has helped Trump win the election, and therefore he will be sort of following through, if you like, with a series of potentially quite radical measures. I think he's described it as the biggest mass deportations, the biggest in U.S. history. If that happens, and there's everything to indicate that some form of it will happen, it will profoundly mark US-Latin America relationship.
Finally, Andrew, in his last presidency, Donald Trump inspired a new wave of populist leaders in South America, such as Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Javier Milei in Argentina. How much does Trump's return to the White House give them a boost?
Yes, it is basically very good news for the far right across Latin America. I'd single out Brazil, where the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, is a sort of, he was quite happy to refer to himself as a tropical Trump. And there's been a sort of parallel series of developments in both countries in which basically what seems to be happening in the United States then gets repeated 2 years later in Brazil. So Trump was elected started his term in office in 2017. Bolsonaro started his term in office in 2019. Both countries have had attacks on, Capitol Hill in the US and on the Brazilian Congress and presidential palace in Brazil. So there is this kind of parallelism, if I can call it that, going on. And although Bolsonaro is now banned from standing for public office until 2030, I think the election of Trump will give his party and his movement a real sort of boost and there will be efforts to revert those legal judgments, perhaps in the way that the US Supreme Court has effectively helped Trump. There will be attempts in Brazil to get Bolsonaro back in the running for some election, either 2026 or 2030.
Andrew Thompson, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. So, after Europe and South America, let's turn to the US great global rival of China. And I'm delighted to say that Robin Brandt, the BBC's former China correspondent, joins me in the studio with a bag full of notes. We're ready to tell
us. Of course.
He's always got in. So the reaction from... Welcome, Robin. It's good to see you.
Hello.
So the reaction from Beijing seemed to be a rather predictable one. It says China will work with the US on the basis of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation.
Yeah, so what
does that mean?
It's the holding pattern, essentially. I mean, congratulating President-elect Trump, restating the principles that Beijing hopes will underpin the relationship. The US ambassador the Chinese ambassador in Washington, D.C. was a little bit more talkative. He talked about warm congratulations and hoping they could have a stable, sound and sustainable relationship. But look, this is very different in terms of what it was for Trump 1.0 back in 2016. And there are three areas around which China will be concerned. A potential heightened trade war. You've been talking about those tariffs, those beautiful tariffs, to quote Mr. Trump, that are likely to come in as he begins his second administration. There's likely to be further unpredictability en masse, which China, of course, finds very difficult to deal with anyway. Global institutions, in terms of the role of NATO in particular, China's not in it, but obviously it has concern about institutions like that. That may be an area on which Beijing is more welcoming of President Trump's potential reluctance and maybe even potential withdrawal from NATO, but also on Taiwan. I mean, the US maintains a legal obligation to Taiwan in terms of, arming it, supporting it. It's not quite the treaty that it has with the Philippines, where it promises to come to its defense. But Taiwan could be an area in which Mr. Trump, on the face of it, has shown more reluctance to support maybe a military intervention if there was to be an attack from the mainland. But on the other hand, any kind of military action by the Chinese aimed at Taiwan would be disastrous for global trade. And that is not something that Mr. Trump wants to see. So three areas of concern. But this is a relationship that's hostile. President Biden essentially continued what Donald Trump had done in terms of the tariffs, and that is going to continue again.
Let's touch briefly on these tariffs. Is there any kind of time scale as to when these tariffs will come in and actually what it will look like and feel like? Because obviously there is a desire for the Americans to be less reliant on Chinese imports, and therefore it will make a Chinese product much more expensive for an American consumer, dissuading them from buying Chinese. What is that going to look like, and how is this going to happen?
Well, that's a very good point, because firstly, this is a continuation of something begun by Donald Trump, continued and maybe even further embedded by President Biden. So this will be the kind of third chapter in terms of the tariffs. So it's a continuation. What will it look like? That's a very, very good question, because critics of Donald Trump said it would simply, the cost that would be added to these products would simply be passed on to consumers. So it's not achieving what President Trump claimed it would achieve. But it's designed to protect US manufacturers. It's designed to keep the Chinese out to an extent. It's also, though, part of a parallel approach alongside further measures to try and freeze out, particularly when it comes to advanced technology, Chinese manufacturers in areas like biomedical, advanced aviation engineering. So you have the tariffs on the one hand, and you have these other measures to try and freeze out, prevent Chinese manufacturers getting hold of very advanced technology to try and slow their advance. But Donald Trump has talked more about tariffs, the beautiful tariffs, as he keeps referring to them too. What level will they be? Will they be against everyone, the Chinese, the European Unions, the Latin Americans? We just don't know. But the talk is of 20%. Already, of course, the US imposes 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So that's the kind of starting point in a very sensitive area in terms of, advanced technology and in terms of competition for US manufacturers.
Robin, stay with us. You're going to bring us a newspaper review in just a moment. But first, with the time at 7:29 here in London, a look now at what else we're following today. The German coalition government has collapsed and Germany's chancellor is to call a confidence vote early next year. Olaf Scholz has also fired his finance minister Christian Lindner over persistent disagreements over economic policy. Ukrainian troops have reportedly clashed with North Korean forces for the first time. The Ukrainian defence minister said there were already contacts between the two sides and that Ukrainian officials expected a more significant number in the next weeks. And the Australian government is to propose a ban on social media for children under 16. Australia is trialling an age verification system to block children from accessing social media as part of a range of measures that include some of the toughest controls imposed by any country so far. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. I gave you a little spoiler alert before the news. Robin Brandt is still here, ladies and gentlemen.
Second tranche.
Welcome, Robin. Nice to see you in the studio. You haven't moved chairs, but you brought in a stack of notes on China. Now you're going to tell us about the papers. And there is not one mention of Donald Trump, is it?
No,
it's a palate cleanser for us all.
It was challenging last night, but let's give it a go. Yeah, this is a non-Trump news section.
What have we found?
Well, so firstly, let's look at news coming out of Malaysia, and 10 years on from the disappearance of that Boeing 777 MH370, in which 239 people lost their lives. They're going to resume the search. The Malaysian government believes there is a credible proposal to once again try and find part of the wreckage in an area off the coast of Western Australia. So there were efforts in 2014 to 2017. A private company called Ocean Infinity had another go at it back in 2018. Nothing since then. Some parts of wreckage have washed up on the other side of the Indian Ocean, but of course, no sign of people, no sign of the people on board. But they're having another go. They believe there's a credible proposal. It's a no-find, no-fee arrangement with Ocean Infinity. $70 million if they find anything. But 10 years on, as pressure continues from the Chinese, most passengers on board were Chinese, they want to try again.
You have to admire their commitment to this one, because it is, as you say, it becomes harder and harder, nigh on impossible a decade on.
Yeah, and look, it's the biggest aviation mystery of modern history, isn't it, in terms of what brought it down, claims and counterclaim about the pilot. And as I said, tiny parts of this aircraft have been found across the other side of the Indian Ocean, but they're going to have another go at searching an expanded area of the coast off of Western Australia, a vast area, 15,000 square kilometres. The Malaysians believe that they can find something. Their pressure continues from the Chinese government. The families of the bereaved, most of them were Chinese, and the reports seem to imply they're going to have another go at it from November onwards.
Let's move to an article in The Citizen to talk about Jacob Zuma.
Remember him?
What's going on here?
Well, look, this is no way to run a political party, but maybe it's symptomatic of what continues to be interesting leadership and management skills when it comes to South African politics. So he was president up until 2018, 6 years out of office. A new competing party, the MK Party, did pretty well in South Africa's elections earlier this year. But it turns out some of the people within that party, and this is basically about a power struggle, say that they've been encouraged, shall we say, according to The Citizen, to give a 10% slice of their parliamentary income to Jacob Zuma, straight into his private bank account. That doesn't seem like an arrangement that's A, healthy, B, not maybe legal, or C, not one they're willing to tolerate. And so there's a legal wrangling going on within the party. He's tried to kick some of these successful parliamentarians out. They're coming back with this counterclaim about these kind of weird financial arrangements that were apparently a show of loyalty to the 82-year-old, but now it's caught up in court. They want the bank accounts frozen of Mr. Zuma, of the MK Party itself. But yeah, a strange way, almost like a tithe in terms of loyalty, the man who leads that party.
And a cursory glance across the internet suggests that Mr. Zuma is is probably all right and may not need that extra money.
Probably all right. Yeah, I mean, how do you describe him? I mean, president for, I think, 2009 to 2018, a hugely powerful and influential person in South African politics, but it was brought down by numerous scandals, some involving palatial places in which he used to live. But apparently, the need for financial assistance continues, and some of those politicians in his party, who, like I say, did well in the elections earlier this year, don't like it.
Finally, let's head to Australia, where there is a break dancer called Reagan. Anybody who watched any of the Olympics will remember her, possibly not for the right reasons. And strangely enough, or perhaps not strangely, she said she's stepping back.
Yeah, I mean, Nine News describes her as the polarising Olympic breaker. I mean, that's a stroke of journalistic genius. She's 37. She's globally famous for achieving very little in terms of when she came to Paris earlier this year and braked for the world to see. But she doesn't want to do it anymore. And she says it's because of the scrutiny going forward. Frankly, the humiliation, I think, that she faced, many people thought unfairly because of her performance. Let me just read you briefly what it says from Nine News. It describes her as a university lecturer. She planned to continue heading into continue her breakdancing, but the backlash that she copped after pulling off moves such as the sprinkler and the hopping kangaroo had killed her drive. So she says no more. She's going to do it privately in her living room with her partner, but the scrutiny, as I said, and as many people saw as a humiliation, which was just completely unjustified, has meant that she's pulling back from competition. It's not going to happen in LA 28 anyway, so there wasn't going to be a place for her there.
Robin Brandt, thank you for bringing us up to date on the non-Trump papers. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
2:36 a.m. in Washington, 8:36 a.m. in Zurich. Now, workers at the US aviation giant Boeing have agreed to a new pay offer, ending 7 weeks of strikes. The latest deal promises a 38% pay rise in the next 4 years and will see the 30,000 strikers heading back to work from today. Well, Anita Mendirata is Special Advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations World Tourism Organization, and she joined Monocle's Tom Webb at the World Travel Market in London to tell us more.
Thankfully, the vote went through by about 59% of the members of the union that were striking. They have agreed to accept a 38% pay increase and benefits and a number of other elements. But thankfully, they've agreed to go back to work, which means we can go back to building airlines again.
And why have they agreed to go back to work this time?
There was a desire for 40%. They started with a 25% offer from Boeing, so they recognized that they pushed as far as they could. And at the very beginning of this strike action, it was very clear that this was about respect. It wasn't just about the numbers. The workforce felt disrespected. So it's clear that they feel heard, even when Boeing turned around at their 30% offer and said that was it, that's it on the table. They continued to stay on the dance floor, and I think that was really important. It shows very much firstly the spirit of the new leader of Boeing, who has come out of retirement. He used to be on the supplier side, so he's very clear in what it means to rely on Boeing. It also reflects the fact that he wants to keep it as one community. So even though he said this is our final offer, it's very much a let's keep talking. And in any conflict, any good leader knows, do not leave the dance floor. So it was a success, and I do believe that the workforce feels respected. And ultimately, they love the Boeing brand. They love the business. It's a massive icon for the United States, for global aviation. So they want to go back to the brand and the business that they love. They just wanted to make sure they go back and they feel protected going forward.
And let's keep the dance floor metaphor going. Who stole the show? Who won the dance competition? Who had the best moves?
Oh, goodness me. I think who actually won is global aviation, because we rely on Boeing. 4 out of 10 aircraft are Boeing when it comes to commercial aircraft. We rely on them for cargo, so all those Christmas presents coming from Santa Claus to get under the tree in time. We rely on them for security and military. We fundamentally, as the traveling public, need Boeing, which is why it's interesting being here at WTM, because this entire travel ecosystem is literally going nowhere without global aviation. So I think the real winner here, and where the applause is coming from, is very much from those watching the dance and waking up this morning very grateful that, oh, thank heavens the strike is over.
And where did it leave the negotiations with the pensions that was lost in 2014?
It's very much been accepted. So there are 2 areas that were going to be determined. Obviously the wage increase of 38%. The issue of benefits is still to be determined because they need to establish exactly what. The issue of incentives, they need to determine the metrics of those to be able to see, what is the performance shift that's required. But the pension agreement was in place, and they were really holding on to that because that was an element of principle. That was infringing on people's futures, not just their current day. So thankfully all of those terms were put in place. Naturally it'll cause the entire industry and business per se to look at how they're treating their workforces. But this has been a masterclass in leadership in many ways. First, the outgoing leadership in, quite honestly, what not to do, and the danger of being so detached from the workforce and so detached from technical excellence that you lose the point. Ultimately, aircraft is about safety in the air. That is what is really the driver. The financial statements will reflect when it is being delivered at a quality level. We now have someone coming back into the industry who is a technical expert. He works with people, not through and over people. And he walked into this knowing the regulators, the FAA, were against Boeing. They seized production of the 737. The workforce was against Boeing. We have issues in the space division. And the customer, the airlines, were furious at Boeing because the delays were there even before the strike. So the CEO walked in knowing exactly what noise he was going to face, and going back to the analogy, he turned down the music so everyone could slow down their rhythm and actually focus. And his message to the workforce today and to all Boeing employees: we've all gone through a hard time. We all need to work together now to restore the iconic brand by listening and working very firmly together as one community. So that's credit where due. It's been an exhausting time, but I, as a member of the traveling public and this industry, am very grateful to wake up to the news this morning.
And an exhausting time for him. How does his future look? What's his relationship going to be like with the unions going forward?
I think it's going to be very respectful and respectable. He, again, has continued. But I think what's really important about the question you ask, Boeing's future is not about his behavior anymore. It's all of Boeing. He cannot fix this on his own. And trust is a currency that needs to be built over time. And that's trust of the workforce, trusting Boeing leadership, trusting ultimately the workforce, that they're all working for that quality and safety of aircraft that Boeing became iconic for. And importantly, customers trusting Boeing that they will deliver the aircraft, travelers trusting Boeing that when they fly, they will safely end up at their destinations. Everyone in the ecosystem. So this is very much an internal and an external quest, and everyone needs to be trusting. But the trust is only earned with proof of delivery. So now it's really about literally getting those deliveries back out into the industry.
And Boeing already having a very difficult time before the strikes. How important is Boeing now to the American economy?
Oh, it's fundamentally important. It represents it's one of the top 3 exports in the entire economy itself. It's fundamentally important. And in addition to being fundamentally important in terms of the financial impact and the percentage of the GDP that it brings in, which is a good 20%, I think what's really important is that Boeing has always been a source of innovation. It's been a source of inspiration. And especially when we look at sustainable aviation and the quest for net zero 2050. Ultimately, Boeing has been at the forefront of developing aviation that is very low carbon emission, very fuel efficient, lighter aircraft, and lighter in terms of the impact on sound. So we need its innovation, not just its economic impact. And the entire industry recognizes that. Interestingly as well, the aviation industry as a whole, so whether it's Boeing, whether it's Airbus, whoever it might be, other industries are looking at aviation to solve some of these sustainability challenges, which they will then adopt in. Because ultimately, aviation is one of the few industries that always invests in innovation that is a year beyond the actual life cycle, quite honestly, of the innovators. It's always been an industry that's developing ideas that are going to be for 2030, 2050, 2080. And so other industries very happily adopt that, because if any industry is going to test and prove that something works, it's aviation. Because when it doesn't work, people suffer. And so that's where it's a really interesting point where global aviation is critical to global economies, global communities and societies. Boeing is critical to global aviation. Everyone wanted to see us get to a point of resolution. So now this is where those that are criticizing, those that are challenging, those that are competing, everyone knows we need to support Boeing, because ultimately, if they don't win, none of us win.
Anita Menderata there, speaking to Tom Webb. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
.45 here in London. It's time to talk business with Isabel Hamilton, senior reporter at the Daily Upside. A very good morning to you, Isabel.
Good morning.
Let's talk about something that we touched on in the headlines a little while ago, that Australia is planning some of the most stringent crackdowns on social media access for children.
Yeah, so the Prime Minister of Australia said that they're planning to completely ban social media for under 16s. The details are not ironed out yet, and it needs to go through Parliament. They said the kids that are already on social media aren't going to be booted off, so that's like the one little detail we've got. But otherwise, we really don't know how this is going to work and whether it'll actually, achieve what it wants to, which is to protect children from the harms that we see online. There's an argument that goes that really education is the solution, not completely banning them.
Indeed. Do we know what constitutes to be a social media platform? Is this something that just stops them from using apps or going on the internet, or what is it? Because there is a sense now that children from the age of 12 are actually being sort of finding their use of their phones is absolutely fundamental to their education in some stages. Schools are saying, go on an app, go on Google and find this.
Yeah, we don't know actually what they mean by social media, and it's going to be a really big point, I think. Does WhatsApp count? If you're trying to get in touch with your kid, that's essentially just texting these days, but it is kind of part of a family of social media apps. Does YouTube count? Which also has a lot of educational content on it for all its flaws. I think defining what social media is going to be a really big sticking point.
And indeed, how do you enforce it?
Exactly. Australia, I think, is saying that they're going to put the onus on their digital sort of watchdog to make sure social media companies are obeying, but enforcement's going to be a really, really tricky area.
Let's move on to the business's reaction to the Trump win in the United States. The US dollar hit a big high yesterday, possibly in the wake of Trump talking about those beautiful tariffs he's going to place on China. But also oil prices went up as well.
Yeah, oil prices went up. They came down at first, but they've gone up because of some uncertainty over what's going to happen in terms of Trump's geopolitics, mainly. Things like he might squeeze the supply from Iran, Venezuela, and on top of this, there is a hurricane brewing in the Gulf of Mexico. So, yes, oil prices did go up, which is, mostly this year they've been coming down because there's a sense that demand is waning and supply is waxing.
Tell us about the general path of oil prices this morning, this whole year. Actually, we've seen the likes of Saudis and actually the OPEC Plus group making sure that they restrict supply in order to keep prices high. Are we likely to see that sort of continuing, or are we going to see prices changing or indeed falling in the wake of Trump's election?
Well, OPEC is going to give up trying to drive the prices higher. I think that's going to happen in January. They slightly delayed it. And yeah, OPEC and large oil companies like Exxon and Chevron have been trying to talk up demand. But I think really reality is starting to bite. We had the International Energy Agency release a report late last month where they sort of reiterated that they see demand peaking fairly soon. And they kind of added on top of that and said that they could even see surpluses of oil and gas by the end of the decade. So really, it feels like oil is having a bit of a cold shower. And yes, OPEC and particularly Saudi Arabia have kind of given up trying to drive prices higher because they realized that by cutting production, they were just yielding too much market share to the US.
Let's move to Canada, but move back to social media. A very strange decision has been made in Canada to shut the Canadian arm of TikTok, however, to allow people to continue access to the app.
Yes. So the rationale that they've given is that this is a national security decision and they're being deliberately opaque about exactly what risks they've perceived with there being a business presence of TikTok in Canada. But exactly, they're leaving access to the app completely untouched, which is very unusual. You know, we've seen multiple countries talk about various restrictions on TikTok, potential ban in the US, lots of countries, including Canada, banning government officials from having it on their phones. But yeah, kicking the actual business out, but leaving the app extant is strange, partly because, if Canada has some kind of problem with something happening on TikTok, who are they going to talk to now? They haven't got a local presence.
Finally, let's talk about Novo Nordisk, the Danish drug giant, which seems to have made its name unbelievably with amazing weight loss drugs.
Yeah, so Novo Nordisk reported their third quarter earnings yesterday, and things are looking pretty good. They pulled in about $10.2 billion. That's up 21% year on year. And the reason this is particularly good timing for them is that their biggest rival, Eli Lilly in the US, this week lowered its revenue guidance, citing manufacturing costs, fluctuating inventory. So at the moment, Novo Nordisk is outperforming Eli Lilly, and it's sort of a two-horse race. That probably won't last. There are other companies kind of coming up on the inside track. AstraZeneca is working on a weight loss pill. Roche is working on weight loss drugs. But yeah, for now, Novo Nordisk is in pole position.
This is an indication, though, that this is going to be a huge growth area for the for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, we haven't really seen any sort of brakes being put on this boom, except for things like manufacturing costs and just the sort of logistics of getting this stuff out into the world. Demand has not ebbed.
Isabel Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Now, Art Week Tokyo has established itself as a major annual international event. More than 50 museums, galleries and art spaces are presenting a stellar lineup of exhibitions, headlined by some of the leading names in both Japanese and international contemporary art. Well, Andrew Merkel is editorial director of Art Week Tokyo. I'm delighted to say he joins us now. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Hi, good afternoon.
Now, this is the fourth edition of an exhibition, of an event, a huge event that evolves from years to year. What do we expect out of this year?
Well, I should clarify that this is our fourth year and our third full edition after our soft launch edition in 2021. And I think what we've seen is that the art scene has gradually come to embrace Art Week Tokyo. And we have an incredible lineup of exhibitions this year, from Louise Bourgeois at the Mori Art Museum, which is a stunning representation of a major international artist, to Keiichi Tanami at the National Art Center Tokyo, who is a Japanese artist who has been active since the 1960s and actually passed away recently and is having his first major retrospective. So I think we have an incredible wealth of art on view. We also have special projects. We'll have art on the AWT bus, which is the biggest, one of the core elements of Art Week Tokyo is providing free bus service to take people around to the different venues. And that's really been an important vector for engaging different audiences than the usual contemporary art crowd.
And among all these wonderful treats, what is it that's particularly on your radar?
I think there's so much to enjoy. I know that the feedback we get from international visitors is that they really appreciate being able to see the younger galleries that aren't going into major art fairs like Art Basel, who are presenting artists that they haven't really encountered before. And it's been very eye-opening for them. And I think for curators, it's also the chance to see how their peer institutions are operating in Japan and to appreciate the real depth of art activity and art practices that we have concentrated in Tokyo.
One of the exhibitions, one of the highlights is an exhibition curated by Mami Kataoka. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Right. So AWT Focus is our curated sales platform. It's conceived as a laboratory for curators to experiment with different narratives of modern and contemporary art in Japan. And so last year's edition was the maiden edition, and the curator Kenjiro Hosaka looked at different kind of canons of visual art and design and craft. This year, Mami Kataoka has delivered a really personal and thoughtful exhibition in response to this very muddled situation that many people around the world are facing with polarized politics, sort of continuing inaction about the global climate crisis and various issues of funding and equity. So she's come up with an exhibition called Earth, Wind and Fire, Visions of the Future from Asia, where she's asking us to revisit the kind of concepts of the cosmos that originated out of Asian tradition and look at how we can maybe learn from them or draw from them in navigating our contemporary situation.
Tell us more about the contemporary situation and the way that artists are actually respond to it, or indeed how Art Week Tokyo's participants respond to the fact that not only is global politics and the whole world actually in a state of extreme flux, but Japanese politics is in a state of change as well.
One of the issues that has been arising this week in talking with the visiting curators and other people at Art Week Tokyo is this question of to what degree art even has to respond in real time to political events. We know that artists do respond in their own time. And so one of the artists in AWT Focus, for example, is Gozo Yoshimasu, who is a poet and a visual artist and multimedia artist. And he, in 2012, a year after the March 11 disasters of 2011, started going into the disaster zone and making a long format poem that has then evolved into a mixed media work that is also a painting and is also a score. And that's his way of reflecting on the disaster and the continuing fallout of the disaster. But it operates on a timescale that has actually it took him several years to complete that work. And he was going year after year to the disaster zone to respond to that. So I think art can provide different temporalities and different modes of engagement from the news cycle or SNS that is really valuable precisely at these times of confusion.
Andrew Merkel, Editorial Director of Art Week Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Angelica Jobson, Tom Webb and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Sana Jimani and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.